Let me just say something. I understand why you want to know about your quizzes, but look, in general, you know, if any of you want to impress your Hoja, come to your Hoja with questions like, Hoja, I would like to know more about the reading. Can you suggest something else for me to read? Hoja, tell me again about Robespierre. What was it he said? What did it mean? Hoja, I would like to know more about history. What's the score on my quiz? Okay, fine. I understand you all want to know that. But two things. One, I didn't bring them to class. That's partly my fault. And that's partly so that I can get you all to come to class on Tuesday. Look, if you're really desperate and you really need to know, you can come to my office after class. Okay. Generally speaking, the scores were very bad. I scored them out of 25 points. The highest score was a 21. The average score was about a 7 or an 8. So the highest score in percentage terms was 84%. Now, yes, I will probably curve it, so if you got 84%, that's probably an A. Well, I'm going to have to do several things. I'm probably going to have to give you my lecture notes before the midterm, because otherwise no one will pass. Otherwise, only several of you will pass. But anyway, let's edit out all of that stuff, and let's get back to revolutionary France. Yes? When will the midterm be? It is in your syllabus, your DERS plan. I believe it is a week from Tuesday? Wednesday. A week from Wednesday. That's right. Okay, so back to... Okay, back to revolutionary France, a much more interesting subject. Now, where we left off, I think we left off with the Duke of Brunswick's manifesto, right? This is the Duke of Brunswick speaking on behalf of, symbolically, the European aristocracy, the monarchs of Europe, the establishment, those who stand for legitimacy and noble birth and law and order as against revolutionary politics, democracy, etc. And he said, remember, please don't lay a hand on the king and queen. He says this in July of 1792. The war has already begun. Austria and Prussia have just kind of begun to enter French territory. It looks very bad for France, basically. Looks like the revolution will probably be ended, and the Duke of Brunswick, remember, has threatened essentially the Parisian mob not to lay a hand on the king and queen, or else he and his army will wreak a model vengeance never to be forgotten, subjecting the people to the tortures they have so richly deserved, etc. Now, it's actually to this period that the Marseillaise dates. We probably won't have time to learn the words today, but you remember how it ends. Allons avant de la patrie. And it goes over to the end, where we have aux armes citoyennes, citizens to arms, formez vos bataillons. Form your battalions. Marchons, marchons, let us march, let us go. The last line, though, is the best. Now, someone knew a bit of French. You knew a bit? No, you knew, yeah, a bit, right. Yes, you were singing with me, yes. What's your name again? Ahmed. Quand sang un peu abreuve notion. Now, what does that mean? Do you remember?
I don't know. I don't remember exactly, but it's...
Sang, you remember, right? Sang. If you've all watched the Da Vinci Code, you probably remember sang real, right? Royal blood. So anyway, sang means blood. So we have quand sang impur and impure blood. Let the impure blood of our enemies water our furrows. You can tell things are getting a little bloody now. Things are getting serious. Yes, it seems like the revolution might be about to be essentially put to sleep, killed off, strangled at birth. And so you get a kind of extremism. Duke of Brunswick says, don't touch the king and queen. Of course, that's exactly what the mob does. They invade the Tuileries Palace, which you can still visit today. Well, they didn't make it into the palace until they had massacred the Swiss guards of the king and queen. So it was an exceptionally violent day. I think one of the queen's ladies in waiting was also killed. They didn't kill the king and queen yet. They sort of put them on trial. But it's it's a significant act. I mean, this has major international implications, which of course, are made sort of official when they finally do guillotine the king, and that's a few months later. But even in between this, things are getting very serious. In fact, the reason I call this the Second French Revolution, this is not really an accepted historical term, but most historians basically say that there is a second revolution. It's much more radical than the first. It's much more serious. And in some ways, it really is the model for modern revolutions, particularly the Russian one. Not least because they proclaimed literally year zero. That is, the world will begin anew from now. Technically, the date of the new world began on the 21st of September 1792. This is when they abolished the monarchy and set up a republic. So if you're counting, and you have to count with the French because they have a lot of these. Does anyone know what number republic we're on today? We're on the 5th today. This is the first. The first republic dated, I suppose, in a literal sense, you could say it lasted 12 years. But really, the thing in its earliest form lasted really only about 2 or 3, and then Napoleon more or less takes over after about 7. Technically speaking, though, in a manner of speaking, you could say that it lasted until Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor in 1804. And this period is actually the same, sorry, that's 1792. This period is also the same period that they used the new calendar for. They literally renamed all of the months. So that instead of January, February, March, well, I don't remember all of the months in order, but I'll give you an example. Thermidor, which I'll talk about in a moment. Thermidor comes from thermal, which you know, which essentially means like heat. So that comes in the middle of summer. You have Vendémiaire and Floréal, which come in the winter. They're all named after natural phenomena. So this is part of the revolutions. You might almost call it a kind of atheism. Getting away from tradition and ultimately Christianity, starting over with rationalism and reason, as they called raison, to try to create a new world of republicanism, popular sovereignty, and as they saw it, reason. In fact, one of the most important innovations of the National Convention, and one of the reasons why I, as an American, refuse to use your metric system, kilometers and meters and grams. Well, because it was created by the French during the Terror, because this was part of their year zero philosophy. They were getting rid of all of the old ways of doing things, including old measurements. Yes, it's true the metric system is based on the base 10 system that we use in mathematics. It is more rational. I understand it makes sense that water boils at 100 degrees instead of 212. I understand all of this. Still, it represents tyranny, the tyranny of a centralized autocratic government. That's part of it. They get very, very radical, the National Convention. They proclaim, ultimately, universal male suffrage, that is, all men can vote. Remember how before you had only the active citizens voting, not passive. They abolished slavery, although, now interesting, this is a bit confusing because in Europe itself, slavery had not been practiced for a very long time. Certainly not Christians enslaving other Christians. The African slave trade, obviously, was still in existence at this time. Such that the French theoretically were banning their merchants and agents from buying and selling slaves. In practice, there was a great big slave rebellion in Haiti not long after they abolished slavery, and so they changed their minds. In fact, the Code Napoleon, which you may have heard is the basis for the law code of modern Europe, actually re-legalized slavery. But anyway, so they're very radical. Universal male suffrage, not female. Abolition of slavery, new calendar. Now the new calendar, the curious thing about it was they didn't just get rid of the months. They got rid of the week. As in, literally, there were no more 7-day weeks. No more Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. If you've seen The Godfather, right? No, she skips one, right? It's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. They got rid of the days. Instead, they replaced them with numbers. I'm not joking. So they divided the year now. How many days are there in a year? 65, right, okay. Now, the new week was not 7 days. It was 10, because remember, this is mathematical. So we have a base 10 system. So now, how many weeks will there be in a year? 36.5. 36 and a half, right? So what do you do with the half week? Now, interestingly, one of the things that they did, which I think a lot of people didn't like, is that before there had been, of course, the Sabbath. That is, no one worked on Sunday. It wasn't until much later into the 19th century that people stopped working on Saturdays too. The Sabbath being the holy day for Christians. So that you got to, in the Christian calendar, every week you got 1 day off every 7 days. In the new calendar, you got 1 day off every 10. So you had to work more often, and no one liked that very much. So partly to make up for this, they said that the last 5 days, the sort of the leftover 5 days at the end of the year, would be non-work days. And they would all be set aside for popular festivals, you know, on behalf of abstract concepts like virtue. So you can see they were starting to lose their minds just a little bit. Things were getting out of control. But part of the reason you had this radical flavor in the air, there are a couple of things. One, you have to understand there was a war on. And at least until about September of '92, this is when, again, this whole chaotic thing happens. You get the Marseillaise, you get the revolutionary fervor, you get the abolition of the monarchy. You also had one event I didn't talk about. This was one of the most extreme of them. It's usually referred to as the September massacres or the prison massacres. And that was literally the kind of mob of Parisians as led by ambitious radical politicians. They literally went around to the prisons because there were rumors that there were foreign spies holed up there. And they would just hold these impromptu trials, a little bit like, if you've seen the movie Gladiator, you know the tradition in ancient Rome, does the gladiator live or die? Essentially, thumb up, thumb down. And they would just summarily decide whether to kill someone as a spy. So you can see the rule of law is also beginning to slip out of control. So all of this stuff happens in the course of really about a month or two, this kind of radicalization. Now, the National Convention, which is elected in September, there are several important things to know about it. I did write the term right here. Remember how I said they have all these different parliaments? You've got the first the Estates General, then the Assemblée Nationale, the National Assembly, then the Constituent Assembly as they write the Constitution, then the Legislative Assembly. That's from 91 to 92. It only lasts a year, the new Constitution. France also goes through a lot of constitutions. This one is in some ways the most important of them all. Usually it's dated 1792 to 95, when they abolished it for this new system, the Conseil des 500, it's usually called the Directory. So you have about 3 years, but they were 3 very important years, which not only gave us the metric system and all of the other radical reforms I talked about, but which also give us our modern political vocabulary, left and right. It actually came down to the seating pattern of the National Convention. Very confusingly, because everyone in the National Convention was a lefty. This is also something important to remember in modern politics. The left tends to crowd out everyone to the right of itself. So that the National Convention itself had already essentially forbidden monarchists to sit. Again, you have on the one hand radicalism, universal suffrage, but, and this is another thing to keep in mind, it's very important as a precedent in modern politics. The most radical, the most democratic was also in some ways not very democratic because only about 1/10 of the electorate actually voted, partly because everyone else was too scared to vote, because they made it very clear that monarchists were not welcome. That is, those who wanted to preserve the monarchy. Now, you can say they had a good point. the king had tried to escape, so the king was guilty of a kind of treason. But they very radically then determined that France will now be a republic with no king, and that anyone who wants to go back to the old ways is essentially not welcome in the convention. Now, that said, there was a so-called right faction in the convention. Those we usually call the Girondins. I think I mentioned this the other day. It's very confusing because they came out of the same club as the Jacobins. They're basically Jacobins. They're just not as radical as the other guys. Remember, politics keeps veering further and further to the left. The Girondins were the radicals who, in the spring of 1792, wanted to go to war. They were kind of almost the most radical then. 6 months later, they're the ones who are actually saying, well, okay, we can be a republic, but let's not kill the king. Right? They want things to slow down just a little. They want national unity. They're fighting the war. That's not enough, though, for the public, for the radicals. You have a bunch of different factions now among the radicals. The so-called left, the ones who sit over way on the left, they too are Jacobins, but we usually refer to them as the Montagnards or the mountain, partly because they were sitting very high up in the convention. This is the faction we would associate with Robespierre. Again, confusingly, Robespierre opposed the war in the spring of 1792. So that in some ways, he hadn't been that radical then. But now that they were fighting a war, Robespierre comes to speak for the people who wanted to be pursued outre mesure, that is, to the utmost, and particularly the people who want to purge opposition. Now, we're not in the terror yet. We're still in fall 92. For now, the main question is about what to do with the king and queen. You know, the Montagnards, the left, they want to execute them as an example to all kings and queens. I mean, they were really radical. There were these ambitious writers. There was a playwright, is it Maréchal, I think? He actually wrote a play. The basic plot of it was like this. You can see they're not very subtle. All of the aristocrats, the kings and queens of Europe, they're all somehow captured, and they're put on an island, and this volcano blows up and kills them all. The end. That was a very popular play at the time. Anyway, so you get an idea of kind of like what the sentiments are. They're very radical. They're very much against the king. They execute the king. They execute Marie Antoinette. And how do they execute them? We know what the guillotine is, right? The guillotine. This is the kind of the falling blade. You know, it falls from, what, about 5 meters up, cuts the head very cleanly. So that supposedly it's more humane, you know, than like the curved sword the Ottoman executioner would use. No, that was a theory. It was more scientific. It was modern. But of course, it was also rather dramatic because it was done in public. And it was very efficient, which meant you could kill a lot of people very quickly. Now, not as quickly as the Nazis would later do it with poison gas, but like a pre-modern version of, shall we say, mass executions, where it becomes possible to kill more and more people. Now, okay, it takes a while for all of this to get going. We have a couple of things. The king is guillotined in January of 1793. The war is still going, by the way. I mean, this winter, like most winters, there aren't as many battles because the troops are holed up, you know, trying to kind of prepare for the spring campaigns. But meanwhile, a civil war is beginning to spread around France. Particularly in a lot of regions in the south, like Avignon, there's an area called the Vendée, which is kind of over to the southwest, towards kind of between Paris and the ocean. Any area that is still loyal to the king is basically now almost in a state of war with the center. Now, this war gets worse that summer when they enact the levée en masse. You should remember this term. I would definitely write this down because what this represents, I mean, literally it just means a kind of, you know, mass rising of the people. But what it refers to in terms of doctrine and law was a military draft. That is, that the state was now coercively recruiting citizens into the army. That it was essentially compulsory now for citizens to serve in the army. You know, something which there were antecedents for this in ancient Rome, but for most of the medieval and early modern period, there had been no real large mass universal conscription armies in Europe. This is the first of what will become a major trend becomes a precedent which by the time of 1914 means that every country in Europe, everyone has their draft card so that you can field armies of 5 million in the case of Russia. The armies are not that large yet, but eventually Napoleon's army, he'll end up putting something like 500,000 or 600,000 men under arms. There's resistance to this. This accelerates the Civil War because, as you would expect, people who don't want to serve the new government don't want to fight for it, and so there is draft resistance. Everything kind of, it's like a kind of anti-virtuous cycle. You've got almost like a cycle of violence now between the opponents of the regime and the regime itself. The more radical the regime gets, the more opposition there is. The more radical the regime then gets in suppressing the opposition. Now again, theoretically the National Convention was elected by universal suffrage. So they think that they represent the whole country, right? They think that they represent the Rousseau's volonté générale, this phrase, the general will, which appears in more and more documents. It's even there in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And you could say they have a point. They are representing this kind of popular fury. But remember, the elections, they hadn't been rigged exactly, but opposition had been intimidated from voting. And so the rest of the public does not see this government as legitimate. Not least because, although technically the convention claims a monopoly on power, parliamentary monopoly on power, power is eventually held. It's a little more complicated than this, but what you usually hear is that the Committee of Public Safety, which is a committee of 12 men, of which Robespierre was the most important, they now begin a kind of dictatorship of the country. Now things get even more radical the next summer. There are a couple of key dates to remember. Just see, I think I did this one right. The 2nd of June. This is just as the kind of the military campaigns are starting to heat up. So, yet again, you've got this kind of radical paranoia. The mob actually invades the parliament itself. Remember how I talked about these journées, these kind of revolutionary days? The women, the housewives go to Versailles. Bastille Day, that was one. Then you have the mob invading the Tuileries when they arrested the king and queen again and eventually executed them. This time they invade the parliament. And they actually arrest 29 so-called right-wing deputies of the Girondins, that is the so-called right faction, the ones who had not wanted to execute the king and queen, the ones who were, again, they were a little wary of how radical things were getting. And they arrested them. And then they eventually guillotined them too. So even parliamentary deputies who now disagree with the kind of radicals in the Paris mob, they are now fair game too. You also get this institution called the Paris Commune, which very confusing. I mean, there are echoes of this down through the ages in modern history. Famously in 1871, Marx himself wrote about that Paris Commune. They are kind of elected, but they're not a parliament, and they claim a mandate much larger than they actually have. They end up working together with the Jacobins, with the Montagnards. And eventually you get all these different overlapping branches of government, all of which are sort of encouraging people to spy on everyone else. I mean, eventually you get this thing, they literally call it a law of suspects, where citizens are advised by the government to begin spying on other citizens and reporting suspicious behavior. You can see why a lot of people begin to see in this the origins of modern totalitarianism. Although, that is, in numeric terms, an exaggeration because the number of victims was much smaller. I mean, in all, the number of victims during the height of the terror from 93 to 94 was probably not more than 20,000, which is a big number, but we're not talking like Hitler and Stalin numbers exactly. But so things are getting more radical. One thing that historians don't always talk that much about, though, but which helps explain where the law of suspects came from, and also the levée en masse, this kind of military draft. In August of 1793, it was one of this interesting kind of pivot moments in world history. Yet again, France had been invaded, that is, the coalition armies. Now it's not only Austria, but it's Prussia. And the convention, you remember how I talked about how they were kind of losing their minds a little bit. They unilaterally declared war on England, Holland, and Spain. They declared war. As if they wanted more enemies, basically. So they declared war on England, Holland, and Spain. Now, again, the theory being these countries were surreptitiously helping their enemies. And so the English then join up, and they actually send a kind of expeditionary force to Europe. Now, the coalition armies, there was a Duke of Coburg who was mostly commanding Prussian troops, and a Duke of York who was mostly commanding English. It's always more complicated than that because they're mercenaries and multinational forces. But basically, the two of them had succeeded in marching into France. They made it as far as San Quentin, which, if you've seen, has anyone seen Casablanca? Nobody's seen Casablanca. Well, anyway, this is when the Germans are about to take Paris, in 1940, Casablanca. They have all these loudspeakers. Die Deutschen stehen von der Toren von Paris. Die Deutschen stehen von der Toren von Paris. That's about where they were. They're about 80 or 100, they're like a little more than 100 kilometers away from Paris. 100 kilometers, maybe 130, 140 kilometers away. Paris, remember, is where all of this is happening, right? You've got the mob controlling the parliament. You've got the execution of the king and queen. The whole revolution, really, is centered in Paris. It's definitely spread to the rest of France, but I mean, you lop off the head in Paris and the whole thing is done. Well, a curious thing happens. The Duke of York gets instructions from Parliament back in London that they want him to go and secure Dunkirk. Dunkirk, you may remember if you know your Second World War history, that's where the British were evacuated after the Germans took France. It's over on the coast of the English Channel. I should have given you a map. But anyway, we're not talking much about the battle here. The interesting thing is just he gets this order randomly. The English want to have Dunkirk. Okay. Well, if they'd taken Paris, they would have had Dunkirk. They would have had it anyway. Instead, they split their forces. The French get very lucky. The French then are able to take the two of them on, one after another in turn. The revolution survives. But this is the kind of panic, the precipitating cause of the most extreme phase of the terror. When you get the levée en masse, this national draft, which again leads to more and more civil war as people draft. You get the law of suspects, where citizens are encouraged to spy on other citizens, report them to their local committees. That is, you could sort of denounce your neighbor and he might end up being guillotined. You thought your neighbor might have talked to an enemy agent or said something which suggested that he sympathized with the Prussians and English and wanted to bring back the king. This is when you eventually get this famous declaration, terror is the order of the day. Now, there's an interesting theory behind this. Robespierre, I mean, most people say he got the idea from Rousseau. In a sense, he did, but it was obviously a particular gloss on Rousseau's idea of the notion of citizens and non-citizens. That essentially in a republic, you had to have active citizenship, whereas anyone who was opposed or disloyal either did not belong to the citizenry or should be eliminated. There are several passages in the social contract which are very ominous if you read them closely. That said, Robespierre really came up with this on his own. As he put it, and I quote, "To establish and consolidate democracy, to establish the peaceful rule of constitutional laws, we must first finish the war of liberty against tyranny." Now, it's interesting because he keeps talking about the future peace and democracy, but in the meantime, we'll suspend the Constitution and we will suspend everyone's constitutional rights and we will fight a war against, as he put it, tyranny. We must annihilate the enemies of the Republic at home and abroad, that is, at home too, or we shall perish. If virtue is the mainstay of a democratic government in time of peace, then in time of revolution, a democratic government must rely on virtue and terror. Terror is nothing but justice, swift, severe, and inflexible. It is an emanation of virtue. This is where you get this curious equation. Virtue equals terror. It's a curious idea. But what it basically means is that people will be virtuous, and if necessary, we will force them to be virtuous. I think Rousseau actually used the phrase, force people to be free. A people cannot be free unless its enemies are dealt with swiftly and inflexibly and severely. That's the theory. So you can begin to see why these ideas plant seedbeds in the modern world. Why particularly Lenin and the Bolsheviks are very enamored of Robespierre. And they love all of this stuff because it gives them a kind of a blueprint, an idea of how they might set up a system and justify terror against their enemies. Now, it is interesting that there was one economic measure taken by the Committee of Public Safety. It's usually called the maximum. Now, again, the Marxists sometimes see this a kind of an early progenitor of their ideas about state control of commerce. It's a bit of an exaggeration. Mostly this was just about price controls. They were trying to control certain commodities like bread and grain. They were also trying to control commodities they needed for the war, such as saltpeter, which you need for gunpowder, that sort of thing. It wasn't really as radical as the Marxists would have it. But there, too, you see a kind of precedent being set. A government which is now trying to direct and control the economy, a government which is trying to control the thoughts of its citizens, that is, to impel obedience and virtue by stamping out disobedience. It sounds a little creepy, frankly. And it got creepy very quickly. Robespierre kind of went on a power trip. Now, it's true he was never a dictator in the modern sense of a Stalin, who could literally just at his whim have millions of people killed and rounded up. The guillotine, as I said, probably took care of only about 20,000 people in the year of the Greatest Terror. That's still a lot in the early modern world. And meanwhile, you had a kind of escalation. I said this. Revolutions tend to get more and more radical. The phrase you sometimes hear is revolutions devour their own children. That is, someone who in 1789 was a hero of the crowds was by 1792 an incorrigibly backwards reactionary. An example of this, a person I wrote about, was a playwright called Marie-Joseph Chénier. His brother was more famous. His brother had a whole opera written about him because his brother was executed under the Terror. And a lot of people blamed his brother Marie-Joseph for not trying to save his brother. They said, Cain, what did you do with your brother? This and that. But what's interesting about Marie-Joseph Chénier is that he was more radical than his brother. He did survive the Terror. In 1789, he wrote a play which made him a hero of the kind of, as they called themselves then, patriots. He was denouncing royal tyranny. By 1793-94, he wasn't radical enough. He was writing plays, and the censor would not allow them to be performed. He got so desperate that at one point he actually went before the Committee of Public Safety, and he burned his own play. He was so desperate, that is, I suppose, to survive. This happened to a lot of people. People who were very radical once. Like 1792, with all this crazy stuff going on, the prison massacres, there's a character called Jacques Danton, who was rallying the masses of Paris. He is the great, he's this big burly man. He's like a big hero of the crowds. They love him, he stands up, he gives these speeches. By 1794, though, he thought that this terror thing was getting a little bit nuts, and Robespierre was kind of out of his mind. And so he started saying we should slow down just a little bit. We shouldn't be running the guillotine round the clock. We should be trying to unify the people, not basically accelerating the civil war. So he was, by this point, then considered to be a kind of, again, on the right. He had gone from the left to the right, just like that. So Danton and his followers, they were called Dantonistes. Robespierre had them guillotined. He had them executed. Now, meanwhile, there were people who, in a curious way, were even further left than Robespierre. I didn't explain the term sans-culotte, by the way, but this, you might have seen this phrase before, sans-culotte. If you see this in the reading, what this means is those who don't wear culotte, which are the sort of like those pants that would come down. You'd have long socks and your culotte would come here. That's what the aristocrats wore. So the idea is like, we are the real salt of the earth. We're the rough people who don't dress like the aristocrats. It's a bit confusing because Robespierre himself actually wore them. He was a culotte. But the sans-culotte, they loved Robespierre. He was the hero of the crowd, the hero of the mob of Paris. So they're egging him on. And so he doesn't like Danton. Danton's not radical enough, so he has Danton executed. But then there's another faction who think Robespierre is not executing enough people, that you actually need to stamp out even more disobedience to enforce virtue. These people, they're usually called Hébertistes because there was a journalist called Jacques Hébert. But there's another one called Jean-Paul Marat, who I'm fonder of because I think he had the greatest quote of the Terror, other than Robespierre's about virtue. He said, "C'est meilleur de tuer 200,000 hommes aujourd'hui qu'un million demain." That is, it is better to kill 200,000 people today than 1,000,000 tomorrow. Wrap your head around that idea. So you need to, instead of 20,000 that is, we should be guillotining maybe 200,000 people. And that way, at some point in the future, the population will be loyal and so we won't have to guillotine 1,000,000 people. Well, so Marat, actually, he didn't have to be guillotined because he was executed by a woman called Charlotte Corday, who was kind of a hero of mine. She herself, of course, was later executed. There are like whole plays. There's even a movie about them, I think. But anyway, so Marat and Charlotte Corday, he's radical. The Hébertistes are radical. So Robespierre decides to do away with them too. So he guillotines those who want him to guillotine fewer people. And then he guillotines the people who want him to guillotine more people. This is usually called a kind of almost triangulation. People compare it to what Stalin did in the 1920s. When he first dealt with Trotsky, who oddly enough was on the left, and then he dealt with Bukharin and his followers who were on the right. The idea being you kind of take a little bit of what you want from both of them. You pretend like you're a middle-of-the-road centrist. You pretend like you're reasonable and the other people are crazy. That's kind of what Robespierre was doing. He wasn't as clever as Stalin, though. He started to, shall we say, let power go to his head a little bit. He actually organized, in May of 1794, he organized something he called the Festival of the Supreme Being. Supreme Being, this being the kind of the deist or the atheist notion of God. Part of the idea is that Robespierre thought that France was being overwhelmed by atheism and godlessness. He himself, not being a proper Christian, didn't want to revert back to Christianity after all the revolution had kind of gone after the church, remember. But he's beginning to think to himself that there's too much anarchy in the land. We can't just tell people that they have nothing but license. And so we need some kind of a new morality. Something to explain all this business about virtue and terror. Something to explain to people how they were supposed to behave. And so he organized this enormous festival that he called the Festival of the Supreme Being. And a lot of people got the idea that, of course, he meant himself, right? The Festival of the Great God Robespierre. That's how people took it. And so how do you deal with the man who guillotines the people who want more people guillotined and the people who want less people guillotined? How would you deal with Robespierre if you're trembling for your life? Well, probably you'd want to guillotine him too. So that's what they decide. It happens gradually. It's a complicated story, but eventually enough people get the idea in their head that all of us living in terror of having our heads cut off is not really a healthy way of going about politics. And so gradually they all decide that they need to get rid of Robespierre and his accomplices. And so they do. And eventually they engineer a kind of political coup d'etat where Robespierre, his key aide, Saint-Just, all of the members of the Paris Commune, in all 83 people, are all guillotined together, one after another, on this great morning of the 27th of July, 1794. They said that after 83 men had been guillotined in rapid succession, the blood was flowing so thick in the Place de la Révolution that it would come up almost to your breeches. And this, as it is usually said, ended the terror. We refer to this as Thermidor. Thermidor being, again, the month, remember, the month meaning kind of heat and summer. Thermidor meaning, in political terms, reaction. So that when people talk about phases of a revolution, like the Russian Revolution, the idea is, when was Stalin's Thermidor, right? When did he stamp out, shall we say, the radicalism? Some people say at some point in the 1930s he had gone back to just an autocracy. I don't know if that's true, but that's what people say. So the idea of Thermidor, then, this term means reaction. In a way, it did end the first period of the French Revolution. The period of both high ideals, but also this period of wild radicalism. It doesn't really end, in a way, until Vendémiaire. I will talk about this next week when we look at Napoleon. This is the month, I think it's September, in 1795, when Napoleon finally figures out a way of controlling the Parisian mob. This mob which in all these journées has been kind of seizing events. And the long and short of that, it's not terribly complicated, is that you fire at the crowd with cannon, or as he called it, grape shot, which is basically you took a lot of small musket balls and encased them in canvas. This is something traditionally used by a navy if you want to knock out essentially like the sails, of a sailing ship, because it spreads rapidly. Modern terrorists sometimes do this with nails and debris that they put in bombs to cause as much bloodshed as possible. Although modern terrorists usually want to kill. The idea of the whiff of grape shot, as it's called, of Napoleon, was to maim, that is, seriously injure as many people as possible without killing, although inevitably some would die, in order to terrorize everyone. That was his own version of terror. And in that way, Napoleon finally seized control of Paris from the mob, and as some people call it, ended the French Revolution. That's 1795. But in other ways, it goes on. As I said, the new calendar, the period of the First Republic, at least in a technical legal sense, lasts really up until Napoleon declares himself emperor in 1804. But meanwhile, the French revolutionaries have given all of Europe a great deal to think about. Not just by, of course, decapitating the king and queen, but by setting up all of these new institutions, by talking about things like democracy, universal suffrage, abolition of slavery, even to some extent women's rights, although it was not as important an idea for them as the others. Basically, they wanted the state to have a much more active role in the rearing of children. They even had provisions when, let's say, your father would be guillotined. Sometimes your mother too. The state would put you in an orphanage. Another thing which had its echoes in communist times, because in communist times, state orphanages would do the same thing. And for the same reason, because a lot of people no longer had parents after they were killed by the state. Well, anyway, they've given Europe a lot to think about. Not least because, for mysterious reasons, the armies, despite these early defeats, have actually become pretty effective. In part because of these new songs like the Marseillaise, where the men think, again, they're fighting for their brethren and for their cause and for the people instead of just for the kings. And in part for other reasons that remain mysterious. And in part because Napoleon was a brilliant general. I think we're probably towards the end of the hour. Yeah. Well, listen, I will tell you again about the exams, that if you're really desperate to know your score, you can come to my office after the class. If not, I will bring them on Wednesday, I promise. Oh, and update. Thanks to Melike. We have now improved versions of the readings with the top not cropped off, as it was before. Did you all get the email? Yeah, okay, so are they charging? Do you have to pay again? I hope not, but I'm not sure. You didn't ask. Well, anyway, it's not that much reading, so it shouldn't be expensive. My apologies about it being cut off. You should get the new version, which I don't think has any words cut off. So for next week, we will look at Napoleon. Please read also the Kennedy pages, which go along with Napoleon's campaign. We'll look at the international effects of the revolution.